Good evening. Between 1920 and 1922, a cell of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation carried out 7 killings, the best known being the assassination of Talat Pasha, the main orchestrator of the Armenian genocide. The operation was named Nemesis after the Greek goddess of retribution and sparked a lot of controversy. Very recently, an Austrian diplomat, expert in conflicts in South Caucasus, Dr. Brigitte Koffler-Betschart, has published a book on Nemesis that takes us back in time on a journey of terrible loss and retribution. Dr. Betschart, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for having me.
Why does an Austrian diplomat bring up the aftermath of the genocide so many years later? Why now?
Why now? Well, maybe I should, first of all, correct a little bit. My current function is not that of a diplomat. I used to be a diplomat many years ago. I'm an author now. I'm a full-time writer. And why now? I think there are many factors to that. One of them being that, of course, we've seen recently how very current this topic still is in the South Caucasus. I've been dealing with questions around genocide for a long time, and I've been concerned with those questions for a long time. Back in the 90s, when I was, as a young diplomat, working at the Austrian mission to the UN, and we had to deal with genocide concerning former Yugoslavia or concerning Rwanda, I was always very interested in this question of how to avoid impunity, how to make sure justice is done to the perpetrators and to the victims. So this is one part of my interest in this. The other part of my interest in it is that when I was living in France in the 90s, this was the first time that I read about the genocide against the Armenian people. And I was shocked that having grown up, having gone to school in a country that used to be an ally of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, I had never heard about this. And I thought that something had to be done to make sure it was never forgotten, this specific genocide. So this was one approach, and the other approach was to deal with justice, with the question of impunity. Then I thought, well, many famous writers, many important scholars have written a lot about the genocide, so what would I add? And at some point I found out about Nemesis. And I thought that was an angle and that was a possibility to make people aware of the genocide against the Armenian people that would maybe not read a huge history book or a huge scientific work, but they would maybe be interested in this kind of, let's say, true crime story, and through that way discover the important information about the genocide.
The dilemma that you tackle in the book is that there was no international legal system at a time when a crime was committed against humanity, and the Operation Nemesis basically was carried out to fill in the gap. But on the other hand, despite this context, this is still lynching. So the court justified Tehleryan. Do you yourself, after all the study you have done, justify those who carried out Nemesis? Do you find them guilty or not guilty?
Well, I think this is exactly the point you're touching about, the most important point, the most important debate around this interesting historic episode. We are talking here about the question of impunity of perpetrators of a crime of an enormous dimension. And interestingly, those two avengers that were caught and that were brought to justice, those Nemesis members that were brought to court, Tehleryan and Tehleryan, they were both acquitted. This is interesting because also how did the two legal systems that were bringing them to court, the German legal system in the case of Tehleryan and the British legal system in the case of Tehleryan, how did they manage to kind of see or approach the case in that way? This is an interesting question. But you were asking, do I think it's justified or not? I think it's maybe interesting to look at it, at this question, the way Raphael Lemkin did, the father of the Genocide Convention. At the time of the Tehleryan trial in Berlin, Lemkin was a young man, a young law student, and he was already fascinated by this case because he was bringing it to the point. He said that this case, that this trial against Solomon Tehleryan shows us two dilemmas. On the one hand, it shows the dilemma that the killing of one person, in this case Talat, by Tehleryan, is clearly a crime by the legal system, seen by the legal system. But why is the killing of hundreds of thousands of people not being seen as a crime in the case of Talat? So this is one dilemma he showed. And the other one is that he said we need a mechanism in place on the international level to make sure there's no impunity for this kind of crimes against humanity, because otherwise there will always be this kind of episodes of images of people trying to take law in their own hands. And I think that's the exact answer to it. And this is why it was so important that Nemesis and the handling of the legal side of the genocide against the Armenian people gave such an important impulse also to the later development of international law and international criminal law.
That was a very balanced and quite a diplomatic answer, obviously coming from a former diplomat, but you are blamed for both sympathizing with Nemesis and condemning lynching. Which one of these accusations holds water?
If you have two so different accusations, I think this is always a good sign, because it means that you look at the topic in a balanced way. And in a way, well, looking from outside, not being involved in something. The idea of my book was never to sympathize either with a group or to condemn something. The idea of my book and of my very thorough research into this topic, and I think it's for the first time, at least in the German-speaking world, that I present so many facts, partly unknown facts about the Operation Nemesis. The idea was never to take part of any side. The idea was always to give a full picture of all those information that is today known and that was for a long time maybe not known.
The title says, I did murder, but I'm not a murderer. Does this not position you as biased in favor of those who committed the murder?
The title does not position me as a person at all, because the title is a quote from the Tehleryan trial. This is something Solomon Tehleryan said in his trial.
But it's been selected as a title.
Yes, because I think we were talking about this dilemma before. We were talking about this dilemma that is shown so clearly by the two trials, by the Tehleryan trial and by the Tehleryan trial, in a sense that we have this interesting question of who's the victim, who's the murderer, who is to be blamed of what. Those trials were basically double trials, both of them. They were trials against the murderer of the perpetrators of the genocide, but they were also trials in a sense of not in a legal sense, but in a sense of public opinion against the perpetrators of the genocide. And I think this specific quote from the Tehleryan trial, which he was using to make his point, shows this dilemma quite well. And this is why I thought, and also my publisher thought, that this would be a very interesting form to put it. In the first book that was published about the Tehleryan trial in the early 1920s, so immediately after the trial in Germany, another quote was used, which is quite interesting because it also sort of points to the same dilemma and points to the same question, which is not the murderer, but the murdered is guilty. This was a quote used in this first publication. I think it points to the same point and to the same dilemma. So choosing this title is certainly not positioning myself as a person.
What is your relationship with Armenia and Armenians?
As I pointed out earlier, I was not very much aware of the Armenian question, of the Armenian genocide, of the further development of Armenia when I was a young student. We did not discuss that very much in Austrian schools or at Austrian universities. When I then lived in France with this huge Armenian diaspora living in Paris and in the south of France, I had many Armenian friends, and I became much more interested in this question. And so this was my starting point, and this was the point when I became involved and became interested, and started studying not only the Armenian history, but in particular the genocide.
Armenia-Turkey reconciliation process going on. The Armenian authorities are quite willing to rehabilitate relations with Turkey, but Turkey and Azerbaijan as well are setting preconditions. What's your comment on this, given the circumstances, the historical context, and the roots of the hostility that you just described?
I think there's a couple of interesting aspects to the question of how do perpetrator states, let's put it that way, states that were at some point in history responsible for crimes of atrocity, for crimes of against humanity, how do they handle this responsibility? And I think even if you have always to be very careful when comparing different genocides, because that never works, because every single one is specific and has specific circumstances. Having said that, if you look, I'm coming from a country that is a perpetrator country, in the sense that Austria was part of Germany during the Nazi era, and therefore is a perpetrator state when it comes to the Shoah, to the genocide of the Jewish people. How did Austria and Germany handle this responsibility, this historic responsibility? Even though maybe they did not always do it with a great enthusiasm, they were very much working on this responsibility. And nowadays in Austria and Germany, we do have monuments for the victims of this genocide. Could you imagine that in the middle of Berlin or Vienna, we would have monuments for the perpetrators? It would be impossible. Or we have laws against the denial of this genocide, of this specific genocide. In other countries, in other perpetrator countries, you don't have laws against the denial, but the denial is sort of, the main argument. So having said this, coming back to your question, how do I see this? If you deny your own responsibilities for an important crime against humanity, then this hostility and then This will always pop up, even years and years after the crime. So I think this is the context in which we have to see this.
What's your next project coming up?
Well, I'm still looking into a couple of Armenian topics, but I'm not yet sure which one I will pick. And meanwhile, I'm working on two other projects that are much more based in Austria, where I live and work.
Would you mention those topics, or shall we leave it for future reference?
We have to leave it at the moment for future reference, because I have not really decided on this. But maybe I hope that my book will be coming out in Armenian as well. A group of people is working hard on making this possible. And I'm looking forward to maybe coming back to Armenia with the book in Armenian, and then we maybe can already discuss about follow-up projects.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Austrian author, former diplomat, expert in conflicts in South Caucasus, Dr. Bridget Koffler-Bedshart joined us from Austria.